Hello my beloved friends, and welcome back to the Untold Stories. Today we will uncover the terrifying events mountain climbers has lived, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a crazy idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying your stay. Right, let's get comfy and relax, and let's begin this episode by the first story, The Whispering Depths by Ethan Carter. We are on October 12th, 2020, at 6:40 p.m. My name is Ethan Carter, and I've been an avid mountain climber for over a decade. Weekends are my sanctuary, my time to escape the grind of the city and lose myself in the raw beauty of nature. This particular weekend, I chose Blackthorn Mountain, a rugged peak deep within the Pinewood Forest. It's not the tallest or most challenging climb, but it's secluded, untouched, and perfect for what I needed: solitude. I arrived at the base of the mountain around 4:30 p.m., my backpack loaded with gear, ropes, carabiners, a lightweight tent, and enough rations for 2 days. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your cheeks but feels invigorating. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows through the dense pines. I decided to set up camp early, about halfway up the mountain, near a small clearing I'd spotted on previous climbs. It was a peaceful spot, surrounded by towering trees and the faint sound of a distant stream. By 6:40 p.m., my tent was pitched, and I had a small fire crackling in the center of the clearing. I sat cross-legged, eating a simple meal of canned beans and jerky, watching the flames dance. The forest was alive with the usual sounds: rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant howl of what I assumed was a wolf. It was serene, exactly what I'd come for. But as night fell, something shifted. Time, 9:23 p.m. The first sign that something was off was the silence. The forest went quiet, no owls, no rustling, not even the wind. It was as if the world had been muted. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe a predator had passed through, scaring the smaller creatures into hiding. I zipped up my tent and lay down, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, but deeper, more resonant. It wasn't coming from outside the tent, it was coming from beneath me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The ground felt wrong. Not solid, but almost porous, like it could give way at any moment. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam around the clearing. Nothing. Just the eerie stillness of the forest. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination when I noticed the cave. It was maybe 20 feet from my tent, partially hidden by a tangle of roots and underbrush. I hadn't seen it earlier, but now it was unmistakable, a jagged mouth of darkness, about 6 feet tall and twice as wide. The beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the gloom inside. I told myself to stay put, to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my climbing axe and approached the entrance. The air around the cave was colder, almost icy, and it smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic, like blood. I hesitated at the threshold, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I heard it again, the growl, but this time it was accompanied by a faint whisper, a voice so soft I couldn't make out the words. It was coming from deep within the cave. Time, 10:47 p.m. I don't know what possessed me to go inside. Maybe it was the climber in me, the part that's always seeking the next challenge, the next unknown. Or maybe it was something else, something darker, pulling me in. I stepped into the cave, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the blackness. The walls were slick with moisture, and the floor was uneven, littered with rocks and what looked like bones. Animal bones, I told myself. They had to be. But then, as I moved deeper, I noticed something worse. The bones weren't just scattered haphazardly. They were arranged in patterns, like some kind of ritualistic arrangement. The more I looked, the more I felt a deep, primal terror beginning to crawl up my spine. The whisper grew louder as I ventured deeper, echoing off the walls. It wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping, murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. My skin crawled, but I kept going, driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain. The cave narrowed, forcing me to crouch, and then it opened up into a larger chamber. What I saw there will haunt me forever. The walls were covered in symbols, crude, jagged carvings that seemed to pulse in the dim light. The air was thick with the metallic smell, and the whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that made my head spin. In the center of the chamber was a pit, a yawning void that seemed to go on forever. And around the edge of the pit were more bones, but these weren't animal bones. They were human. There were other things too, things I couldn't quite comprehend. Shredded remnants of clothing, bits of equipment that looked too modern for this place. A backpack. A broken wristwatch. My blood ran cold as my mind began to piece it together. These were not just human remains. They were the remains of others who had ventured here before, climbers like me, hikers, and more. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering. The whispers turned to screams, and the ground beneath me began to tremble. It was as if the earth itself was waking, angry at my intrusion. I turned and ran, scrambling through the narrow passage, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cave seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around me. I could feel something behind me, something vast and ancient, reaching out, trying to pull me back. Time, 11:34 p.m. I burst out of the cave, collapsing onto the forest floor. The whispers stopped, and the forest was silent once more. For a moment, I thought I had escaped, but then I heard the snapping of twigs behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat. There, at the edge of the clearing, standing just within the shadows, was a figure. Pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that gleamed with a disturbing hunger. I had no time to react before the figure took a step toward me, and I felt an icy chill flood my chest. The same cold that had seeped from the cave. My hands shook as I reached for my climbing axe, but it was too late. The figure was gone, vanished into the dark undergrowth as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my axe, staring at the cave's entrance, my mind racing with questions I had no answers for. I could feel it. Whatever was in that cave wasn't done with me. I wasn't alone, not here, not in this forest. The darkness had eyes, and it was watching me. At dawn, I packed up my tent and left, abandoning my plans to climb the mountain. I didn't dare go any higher, and I knew I couldn't stay there. The forest was no longer a sanctuary, it was a prison, a place where something ancient and terrible lurked, waiting for its next victim. I haven't been back to Blackthorn Mountain since. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, as if the cave is calling me back. I don't know what was in that pit, what ancient horror I stumbled upon, but I know this: some things are better left buried. And some caves should never be entered. Let's dive into the next story of this episode that will make you see the real struggle of addicted people. We titled it The Echoes of the Wild by Claire Bennett. November 3rd, 2022, at 5:12 p.m. My name is Claire Bennett, and I've been part of a tight-knit group of climbers for years. We call ourselves the Summit Seekers, 5 of us who share a passion for scaling the most remote and challenging peaks. This time, we chose Hollow Ridge, a jagged, lesser-known mountain range deep in the Whispering Pines wilderness. It was supposed to be a weekend of camaraderie, adventure, and pushing our limits. None of us could have predicted what awaited us. Our group consisted of me, my boyfriend Mark, our friends Jess and Ryan, and our guide, Tom, who had been to Hollow Ridge once before. We arrived at the base of the mountain around 3 p.m., the autumn air crisp and the sky a deep, cloudless blue. The plan was to hike to a high-altitude campsite, spend the night, and tackle the ridge the next morning. Tom warned us that the area had a strange reputation among locals, stories of odd sounds, unexplained disappearances, but we brushed it off as superstition. We were seasoned climbers, after all. What could go wrong? At 7:45 p.m., we reached the campsite just as the sun was setting. It was a narrow ledge on the mountainside, surrounded by towering pines and a sheer drop to the valley below. The view was breathtaking, but there was something off about the place. The air felt heavier, and the usual sounds of the forest were absent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence. We set up our tents quickly, eager to get a fire going and warm up. That's when Jess noticed it. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all froze, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, we heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere deep within the mountain. Tom tried to laugh it off. "Probably just the wind," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We all felt it, the unease, the sense that we weren't alone. The clock now at 9:30 p.m. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees. We tried to relax, telling stories and sharing jokes, but the thumping never stopped. If anything, it grew louder, more insistent. Ryan, ever the skeptic, decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and walked to the edge of the campsite, shining the beam into the darkness. "Guys," he called back, his voice tense. "You need to see this." We joined him, and what we saw sent a chill down my spine. Just beyond the campsite, partially hidden by the trees, was a narrow fissure in the rock face, a cave. The thumping was coming from inside. The entrance was jagged, almost like a wound in the mountain, and the air around it was unnaturally cold. "We should check it out," Ryan said, his curiosity piqued. "No way," Jess replied, her voice trembling. "That's how horror movies start." Tom agreed with Jess. "We're here to climb, not explore caves. Let's just get some sleep and stick to the plan." But the cave seemed to call to us, its dark mouth beckoning. We returned to the fire, but the thumping kept us on edge, making it impossible to relax. At 11:15 p.m., I was the first to hear the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It was coming from the cave. I shook Mark awake, and together we listened, our breaths shallow. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, forming words we couldn't quite understand. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence was worse. We woke the others, and we all sat huddled around the fire, too scared to sleep. That's when Ryan noticed something in the trees. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing. We followed his gaze, and there, just beyond the firelight, were figures, shadowy, humanoid shapes standing perfectly still, watching us. Jess screamed, and the figures vanished as quickly as they had appeared. We spent the rest of the night in silence, our eyes darting to the trees, the cave, the darkness beyond. But then came something worse. The ground beneath us began to tremble faintly, like a distant rumble of thunder, only there was no storm. As the clock hit 3:27 a.m., the worst came just before dawn. The thumping had grown so loud it felt like the mountain itself was alive, vibrating beneath us. The cave pulsed with an energy we could feel in our bones. Then, from the cave, came a sound I'll never forget, a deep, guttural roar that echoed through the valley. The ground shook, and the trees swayed as if caught in a storm. We grabbed our gear and ran, abandoning the campsite, the fire, everything. As we scrambled down the mountain, I glanced back. The cave was glowing, a faint, sickly light emanating from its depths. And standing at the entrance were the figures, their eyes reflecting the light like those of animals. But this time, I saw something else, what looked like human silhouettes, their forms contorted and twisted, their faces obscured by shadow. Ryan was the first to break the silence. "We're not safe. We need to get out of here, now." We ran faster, the once familiar path now feeling like a labyrinth. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches clawing at our clothes, as though the forest itself was trying to hold us back. Every step felt heavier, as if the mountain was pulling us deeper into its grasp. By 6 a.m., we made it back to the base of the mountain just as the sun was rising. None of us spoke on the hike back to the car. We didn't need to. We all knew we'd experienced something beyond explanation, something that defied logic and reason. But even as we descended, the thumping followed us, distant at first, but growing louder, as though the mountain was calling us back. Each of us felt it, that sinking sense that the mountain wasn't done with us. That the cave, and whatever lived within it, was still watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We haven't spoken much about that night since. Ryan tried to research Hollow Ridge, but he found nothing, no records of the cave, no history of strange occurrences. It's as if the mountain doesn't want to be known. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the thumping, faint but unmistakable. And I wonder if the cave is still there, waiting, calling to anyone foolish enough to answer. The forest feels alive, and its whispers are ever present, creeping through my dreams. I don't know if we were meant to leave, or if we were marked forever. Hollow Ridge remains unconquered, and I pray it stays that way. Some mountains are better left unclimbed. Some caves should never be entered. And some things, once awakened, can never be silenced. Our last story of today's episode, called The Shadows of Wilderness by Daniel Harper. September 17th, 2019 at 5:30 p.m. My name is Daniel Harper, and I've always been drawn to the wilderness. There's something about the untouched beauty of nature that calls to me, a sense of freedom and adventure that I can't find anywhere else. This time, I convinced 3 of my closest friends, Sarah, Mike, and Emily, to join me on a weekend camping trip to Black Hollow, a remote valley nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. But Black Hollow had other plans for us. We arrived at the trailhead around 2 p.m., the autumn sun casting a golden glow over the forest. The hike to the valley was steep but manageable, and we made good time, reaching the campsite by 5:30 p.m. The valley was stunning, surrounded by towering cliffs and dense, ancient trees. But there was an undercurrent of unease, a feeling that we were being watched. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and every now and then, a chill would creep up my spine despite the warmth of the day. We set up camp quickly, eager to enjoy the serenity, but there was something about the place that felt off, like we were intruding on a land that didn't want visitors. The wind whispered through the trees, but the sound wasn't natural. It was as though the trees themselves were trying to tell us something, but the words were lost in the breeze. At 7 p.m., we set up camp near a small stream, the sound of running water providing a soothing backdrop. As the sun dipped below the cliffs, the temperature dropped, and we gathered around the fire to cook dinner. That's when we first noticed the shadows. They were subtle at first, dark shapes flitting between the trees, just beyond the firelight. We tried to convince ourselves it was just our eyes playing tricks, but the shadows seemed to move with purpose, darting closer whenever we looked away. Every time I turned my head, it felt like they were right on the edge of my peripheral vision, just out of reach. Probably just animals, Mike said, though his voice lacked conviction. Sarah nodded, but her eyes kept darting to the trees, her unease palpable. The wind shifted, and the fire sputtered, casting strange, elongated shadows across the campsite. I thought I saw a figure standing near the tree, motionless. But when I blinked, it was gone. Did anyone else see that? I asked, my voice low. But Mike just shook his head, clearly not wanting to acknowledge what we were all starting to feel. The shadows, however, seemed to grow bolder. The air grew heavier as night fell, thick with an almost electric tension. By 9:45 p.m., the shadows grew bolder as the night deepened. They lingered at the edge of the campsite, their forms indistinct but undeniably humanoid. Emily, the most pragmatic of us, grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam caught one of the shadows, and for a brief moment we saw it clearly, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness. We all froze, staring at the spot where it had been, our hearts pounding. I could feel a cold sweat trickling down my back, but we were too terrified to move. We tried to laugh it off, but the tension was thick. The fire crackled, and the shadows danced just beyond its reach, their presence a constant reminder that we weren't alone. The air felt colder now, and the wind howled through the trees, almost like a voice calling out to us, if that was even possible. As the time hit 11:30 p.m., the whispers started around midnight. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of the stream. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they were all we could hear. The voices were distorted, overlapping, speaking in a language that was both familiar and alien. It felt like they were inside our heads, clawing at our thoughts. The whispers were like a strange echo of forgotten memories, speaking of something terrible we were meant to forget. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Now." But leaving wasn't an option. The trail back was treacherous in the daylight, let alone in the pitch black of night. We decided to stay put, huddling together in the largest tent, our flashlights casting shaky beams on the walls. As we sat there, the whispers grew louder, almost like they were circling the tent, getting closer, pushing into our minds. At one point, I thought I saw the silhouette of a person just outside the flap of the tent, their figure thin and unnatural. I reached for the zipper, but it was gone before I could move. At 2:15 a.m., the worst came in the early hours of the morning. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, from the trees, came a sound that froze my blood, a low, guttural growl, followed by the snapping of branches. Something was coming. We peered out of the tent, our flashlights illuminating the campsite. The shadows were everywhere now, their forms more solid, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved with unnatural speed, circling the campsite, closing in. Their bodies shifted in the shadows, like they were part of the night itself. We couldn't see them clearly, but we could feel them, their cold presence pressing in on us. "We have to make a run for it," Mike said, his voice tight with fear. We grabbed what we could and bolted, abandoning the tent and most of our gear. The shadows followed, their whispers rising to a cacophony as we stumbled through the forest. The trail was barely visible in the moonlight, and we tripped over roots and rocks, our breath coming in ragged gasps. It felt as though the trees were closing in on us, the forest alive with something ancient and vengeful. As we ran, I could hear footsteps behind us, fast, heavy footsteps that weren't our own. I dared not look back, but the feeling of something chasing us, something that wanted to catch us, was almost overwhelming. I could feel it right behind me, breathing down my neck. We weren't just running from the darkness. We were running from something that had been waiting for us. At 4 a.m., we made it to the car just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The shadows didn't follow us beyond the tree line, but their whispers lingered, echoing in our minds long after we'd left Black Hollow behind. As we drove away, none of us spoke. We couldn't bring ourselves to say anything. The terror of what we had just experienced felt too immense to put into words. But there was one thing we couldn't ignore: the forest had changed us. It had taken something from us, something intangible, but no less real. We knew we had narrowly escaped something far older and darker than we could understand. We haven't spoken much about that night. The experience left us shaken, our bond as friends strained by the shared trauma. But one thing is certain, we'll never return to Black Hollow. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable. And I wonder if the shadows are still there, waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into their domain. Black Hollow is a place of beauty, but it's also a place of darkness. And some darknesses are better left undisturbed. What we encountered wasn't just the terror of a haunted place, it was something far worse. It was as if the land itself hungered for souls, waiting patiently for the next unwitting travelers to enter, to be swallowed by the ancient, malicious forces lurking within.